details. For those still on GoToMeeting, apologies. Please use the webcast link that is in the chat box or on the Zero-Emission Transportation website. And hopefully everyone else can find this on time.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm Annalisa Schilla. I'm here from the Air Resources Board from our new Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division. And we're here to hear your thoughts on this workshop about policy recommendations to improve zero-emission vehicle programs. This is part of a report that Melanie Zauscher, the lead staff, has been working with many different programs across the board to pull together in response to Senate Bill 498, which was signed a year and a half ago and requires CARB to do a number of things, including provide policy recommendations to the legislature on how we can increase zero-emission vehicle adoption both for fleets and personal use. We have a number of staff sitting at the table with us from various different programs at CARB, so I will briefly mention their names, and then we can go ahead and start the presentation, and then we'll have some discussion. So William Lung from the Office of Economic and Policy Analysis, I think. And then Ali Questani from the Mobile Source Control Division. Okay, Hershey Shahi, also from the Mobile Source Control Division, and Leslie Baruti from also the new Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division. So with that, Melanie, can you please get us started? And apologies again, everyone, for the technical difficulties.
Is there a way to check that folks on the webcast can hear us now? No? Well, fingers crossed. Yeah, no, so that's why we changed the GoToMeeting, which was supposed to have a cap of 1,000 to the Cal EPA webcast. So if you want to text your friends, your colleagues to go to the Cal EPA webcast, the link is now on the Zero Emission Vehicle Transportation website as well. What's the address? It's calepa.ca.gov/webcast. It's on the homepage, yeah. Oh, say that again? Why don't you say it on your mic?
The website should be video.calepa.ca.gov.
And I guess I should have taken care of the housekeeping announcements earlier, but as you're familiar, if there is a fire alarm, we are required to evacuate. Please follow us down the stairs to the park across the street. You can do it from here if you want to sit. All right, so today's presentation will be Is there some feedback I hear? Went away. All right, let's see if hopefully it doesn't come back. Today's presentation will be divided into two main topics. The first is the background, and then the second are the draft policy recommendations to improve zero-emission vehicle uptake. This screen is not letting me see. The goal of today's meeting is to hear your feedback on how to improve these policy recommendations. I would prefer if you could please hold your questions until the end. First, the background on Senate Bill 498, which was authored by Senator Skinner and passed in 2017. The bill requires, among other things, for CARB to review our programs affecting the adoption of light, medium, and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles, including identifying their goals, the status in meeting their goals, and a cost-benefit analysis. It also directs CARB to compare our zero-emission vehicle programs with those of other jurisdictions, as well as to make recommendations to the legislature to maximize the effectiveness of the programs and to encourage zero-emission vehicle adoption by private consumers and in fleets. Because the statute specifically asks for the policy recommendations to undergo a public review process, that is the focus of today's meeting. Let me remind you why zero-emission vehicles are important for California. Currently, the light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles and the fuels that use them, the fuels that power them, contribute significantly to the total emissions. In this figure, you can see the smog-forming nitrous oxide emissions contribute over 90% from the transportation sector, and the transportation sector also contributes over 90% of the toxic diesel particulate matter and about half of the greenhouse gas emissions. In particular, major population regions within California do not meet health-based federal air quality standards, and these are becoming more stringent over time. California has also set a greenhouse gas target of a reduction of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. In order to achieve the state's public health, air quality, and climate goals, zero-emission vehicles are essential wherever feasible. By zero-emission vehicles, I'm referring to battery electric, plug-in hybrids, and fuel cell vehicles as defined by CARB's zero-emission vehicle mandate. Of the 2 million light-duty vehicles sold statewide, only about 6% have been zero-emission vehicles. In the last decade, over 500,000 light-duty zero-emission vehicles have been sold. In the medium and heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle market, it's a very different story. It's a much younger market. There are no more than about 1,000 medium and light-duty zero-emission vehicles on the roads today. But there are many available trucks and buses that are zero-emission across many different vehicle classes and vocations, and many more are in the pre-commercial phase. A lot of work remains to be done to transition the light, medium, and heavy-duty fleet of the California vehicles to be zero-emission. The California Air Resources Board therefore has many programs that affect the adoption of zero-emission vehicles, and these are divided into 3 programs. The regulatory programs are the ones that help ensure vehicle manufacturers produce zero-emission vehicles, like the Advanced Clean Cars and the Advanced Clean Trucks, or that zero-emission vehicles are used in certain applications or fleets, like the Zero-Emission Airport Shuttle Regulation and the Innovative Clean Transit Rule. Incentive programs help encourage consumers and fleets to purchase or lease zero-emission vehicles. Okay. The webcast, what happened? She doesn't hear anything. Well, that's an issue. Hold on a second. Okay. So hopefully folks on the webcast can hear. If not, please do let us know if we hear more than one person saying you can't hear me. We'll do something. We'll try to do something. Right, so the incentive programs help encourage consumers and fleets to purchase or lease zero-emission vehicles, like the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project and HVIP. They also help pilot and demonstrate zero-emission technologies in new applications, like advanced technology demonstration projects and clean mobility pilots. Last, we have the supporting programs. These are programs that help provide fuel and infrastructure to power these vehicles across the state, help increase education and awareness among consumers and fleets, and collaborate to identify and share best practices. In order to transition all the vehicles on California's road to zero-emission technology, we need regulatory incentive and supporting programs working in coordination and supporting each other. Next, I will provide a very high-level overview of all the programs that will be discussed in the Senate Bill 498 report. First, we'll start with the light-duty programs that affect the adoption of zero-emission vehicle programs. There are 8 of these programs. In blue on the left, you see the regulatory programs. There's 3 of them, with 2 currently with the dashed lines indicating they're in development. There are 4 incentive programs in the red, and 3 of them have a primary goal of increasing equity within transportation. The low carbon fuel standard is in the middle, and it's half blue and half red because although it is a regulation, they also provide incentives for vehicles and for the fuel. I'm not going to talk any more detail about any of these programs because there's no time. As you see, now there's 19 heavy-duty programs that affect the adoption of zero-emission vehicles. All these programs have some component of zero-emission vehicles. Same color scheme as before. There's about half of the programs are in development, either because the regulatory programs have not been approved by the board yet, or the incentive programs have not finished either selecting, administering grantees, or finishing setting up the program. And of course, there are many more heavy-duty programs than light-duty programs because there are many more applications for heavy-duty and medium and heavy-duty vehicles, more vocations and applications. And each of these programs does serve their own niche. Last, we have the supporting programs. There are 7 of these programs, and we've broken them up into 3 categories. The fuel and infrastructure, the education, those that increase awareness of these vehicles, and then collaboration that help promote the best practices. Again, the report will describe, evaluate these programs, but I wanted to provide at least some context of what programs there were so that once I talk about the policy recommendations, maybe it makes more sense. And so now we'll be moving on to the draft policy recommendations. So to remind you, the statute directs CARB to make recommendations to the legislature to maximize the effectiveness of our programs and to increase ZEV adoption generally and in fleet use. A lot of work has been previously done into identifying actions that would promote ZEV adoption through the California ZEV Action Plan and ZEV Action Plan Priorities Update. Our strategy was to build upon those efforts and identify areas specifically that needed a boost. The visual here highlights the process we used to come up with the recommendations. We used the bottom-up approach. Starting with CARB staff working on the 32 programs identified earlier and informed by the review of these programs, we brainstormed ideas that would improve the programs and adoption generally. Then we organized these into common themes. Last fall, we also consulted with the University of California Institute of Transportation Studies as directed by statute and received very constructive feedback. We have also started consulting with sister state agencies, the 7 listed on this slide. And now we are, of course, requesting your feedback, a broader group of stakeholders. So next, I will go into some very wordy slides. The different policy recommendations are grouped into 9 categories. And because I couldn't put more words in here, these are high level for now. In the report, there will be more examples and more context. So pardon the wordiness, and I promise a quiz at the end, so pay attention. So the first set of policy recommendations center around providing long-term signals to maximize private investments in the ZEV market, including infrastructure and the vehicles. A in particular is to provide predictable long-term funding for zero-emission vehicle and infrastructure projects in order to maximize opportunities to programs that incentivize consumers, fleets, and infrastructure development. Specifically, CARB's low-carbon transportation investments and the Air Quality Improvement Program and the California Energy Commission's Alternative and Renewable Fuel and Vehicle Technology Program would benefit from having stable funding over multiple years. That is not a surprise to stakeholders. This recommendation also includes long-term funding for programs benefiting low and moderate income and disadvantaged communities. This recommendation is important because buying a vehicle is a long decision process, and rebate certainty allows buyers to count on availability. Fleet-oriented support programs take time to match customer with product, necessitating year-over-year certainty that government support programs will be there when they are ready to implement. Infrastructure investments can sometimes take years to develop, and long-term certainty allows the development to proceed. I'm going to take some water for a second. Oops. All right. B is to provide long-term certainty to support private investments in market programs such as the low-carbon fuel standard. What this means is allowing the market to continue its success without any interruptions. C is to set clear targets for zero-emission vehicle regulation that demonstrate a viable path towards full transition to zero-emission vehicle technology across all sectors in order to send a strong signal to vehicle manufacturers that California is serious about ZEVs, and thus they should invest as well. The second set of policy recommendations involves reducing the purchase cost of zero-emission vehicles until they are comparable to conventional vehicles. One of the main barriers of ZEV uptake is the increased upfront costs. A is to continue funding programs aimed at increasing low and moderate income and disadvantaged communities' access to zero-emission transportation and clean new mobility services. B is to equalize the sales tax levied on zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure so that it is equivalent to that of a comparable conventional vehicle, especially for buses and heavy-duty vehicles. C is to develop a self-sustaining program designed to improve transportation equity among low-income households and disadvantaged communities that incentivizes the purchase or lease of new and used zero-emission vehicles by imposing a fee on vehicles that emit high GHG emissions. D is to provide low and moderate income zero-emission vehicle consumers with a reduced annual Senate Bill 1 electric vehicle fee, either prorated based on the vehicle's value or the vehicles driven. The third set of policy recommendations are related to zero-emission vehicle fuel pricing. A is to design electricity rates to support transportation and electrification, including for priority populations. In particular, individuals and fleets have a difficult time estimating electricity pricing due to complex electricity rate structures and demand charges. The California Public Utility Commission is currently undergoing a rulemaking that would address this issue for investor-owned utilities, but we also recommend that this applies to publicly owned utilities. B is to identify strategies to reduce the price of renewable hydrogen production, such as defining transportation and electrification with respect to Senate Bill 350 to be inclusive of hydrogen. C is to encourage low-carbon energy storage, energy generation, and load management strategies, including demand response, smart charging, time-of-use pricing, and grid integration in order to help consumers and fleet operators predict their electricity bill and lower the cost of transportation electrification. The fourth set of policy recommendations revolve around zero-emission vehicle infrastructure. A is to encourage holistic planning and investments in ZEV infrastructure. There are many productive ongoing efforts focusing on electric vehicle charging infrastructure in all transportation sectors, thanks to Assembly Bill 2127 and Senate Bill 350. On the hydrogen side, there is also a significant effort being done through Assembly Bill 8, but this is limited to the light-duty sector. Therefore, this recommendation is to bring the planning and investments in the hydrogen off-road, medium, and heavy-duty sectors up to speed with the ongoing efforts and to plan holistically across both fuels through a multi-agency effort. B is to incentivize the deployment of ZEV infrastructure within and near low and moderate income communities and disadvantaged communities to maximize the health benefits and accessibility of clean transportation options in these communities. This would include incentivizing electric vehicle charging stations at multi-unit dwellings and affordable housing complexes, and hydrogen stations where they can accrue the most benefits for these communities. C is to encourage public investments in ZEV infrastructure designed for multiple purposes in order to maximize their usage. This means identifying the refueling needs of privately owned vehicles, fleets, and new mobility services, as well as sectors beyond the light duty, including transit, delivery vehicles, and more, in order to inform siting and ensure larger vehicles can access these stations where appropriate. C is to require charging infrastructure at state facilities where technically feasible in order to lead by example and support the usage of zero-emission vehicles in state fleet. E is to support long-term research and development in the next generation of ZEV refueling infrastructure technologies, such as wireless charging, ultra-fast charging, and portable stations, as well as operational strategies in order to facilitate the ease and speed of refueling ZEVs. Almost halfway done. The fifth set of policy recommendations are related to authorizing local governments to promote policies that promote zero-emission vehicles. Local jurisdictions currently do not have this authority. A is to allow local jurisdictions to create zero-emission zones, either spatially or temporarily, where only zero-emission vehicles are allowed to operate or can enter without access fees compared to internal combustion vehicles. And to design these zones with provisions to minimize negative impacts on low and moderate income households and disadvantaged communities. B is to allow local governments to implement pricing mechanisms that favor vehicle miles traveled reductions, high occupancy, ZEVs, and mobility needs for low and moderate income and disadvantaged communities. These pricing mechanisms could be things like congestion pricing, cordon pricing, or operating fees and new mobility services, which would create new revenue to address regional mobility needs. This recommendation is to design and implement these pricing mechanisms in a way that minimizes negative impacts and maximizes benefits to these populations. The sixth set of policy recommendations has to do with increasing zero-emission miles, not just the number of zero-emission vehicles, and recognition of the goals of improving air quality and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A is to incentivize or require a minimum fraction of zero-emission miles in new mobility services and high-mileage fleets, such as car sharing, transportation network companies, on-demand delivery services, taxis, and driverless vehicles. B is to require local government light, medium, and heavy-duty fleets to have a minimum number of zero-emission vehicles as these become available to meet their needs. This is already required for transit operators through the innovative Clean Transit Rule. C is to leverage data-driven technology, such as loggers and telematics, in the state's light, medium, and heavy-duty fleet to find opportunities to decrease overall miles traveled while increasing zero-emission miles traveled. Targets would be set based on the data collected and the availability of zero-emission vehicles to meet the state's needs. D is to incentivize vehicles contracted by the state to be ZEVs, including long-term leases and rentals, as well as short-term rentals and new mobility services used during state employee travel. However, for state employee travel, we first recommend that vehicle miles travels are reduced by increasing the travel lodging rates to allow folks to stay as close as possible to the trip's purpose in order to avoid having to rent and use a vehicle and pay for parking. The seventh set of policy recommendations is focused on ZEV outreach and education. Multiple studies have found that ZEV awareness is low. If consumers and fleet operators do not know about these vehicles, they won't buy or lease them. Similarly, if they are misinformed, they will not consider them. A is to identify dedicated funding for zero-emission vehicle consumer and fleet outreach and education campaigns, including for disadvantaged and low and moderate income communities. B is to continue supporting the next generation of zero-emission vehicle regional readiness planning and implementation that take into account newer vehicle and technology infrastructure and the evolution of mobility. This would include support to involve local communities in the development and implementation of the planning efforts. These plans provide an opportunity for local governments to identify priority actions they can take to prepare for increased ZEV deployment. These actions include removing barriers for ZEV infrastructure deployment, updating ordinances and building codes, and identifying the type and number of ZEV infrastructure needs, as well as where to site them. C is to fund training for local government building, planning, and inspection officials to facilitate ZEV infrastructure permitting for Assembly Bill 1236. Compliance with this bill has been low because the statute did not include any funding support. Additionally, this recommendation calls out training for builders as well, so they understand the process for permitting this infrastructure, and they are also better prepared when requesting a permit. The eighth set of policy recommendations center around supporting zero-emission vehicle transition through workforce development and training. Workforce development has come up repeatedly during regulatory and incentive stakeholder meetings. Developing a qualified workforce that can manufacture and support zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure will enable the ZEV market to grow quickly. A is to invest in programs that build partnerships between educational institutions and zero-emission vehicle-related employers in alignment with California's Workforce Development Board's initiatives to identify the occupation and skill gaps expected from the ZEV transition and to promote job preparation for the identified gaps through professional development, training, and apprenticeships. B is to secure the long-term transition to zero-emission technology by funding strategic workforce development and training, including curriculum development and vocational instruction, especially within disadvantaged communities. B is to analyze how public investments in zero-emission vehicles and infrastructure impact jobs and to identify strategies to improve the quality of these jobs. And the last set of policy recommendations is focused on providing administering agencies additional flexibilities. A is to keep programs simple and streamlined for consumers and fleets to understand and access. For example, this would include removing barriers in order to be able to provide point-of-sale rebates. B is to provide administering agencies with discretion and flexibility to develop and implement programs that are aligned with the state goals while allowing these programs to remain nimble with the evolving ZEV market. For example, this would include not prescribing dollars to specific ZEV technologies and not requiring inclusion of low-carbon technologies. This way, the administering agencies have the flexibility to allocate the funding based on the current state of the ZEV market and other external factors. C is to extend funding expenditure deadlines, especially for technology demonstration projects, pilots, and programs that include ZEV refueling infrastructure in order to maximize program impacts. Funds allocated to CARB must be encumbered within 2 years and liquidated within 2 more. Because it takes a long time to build pre-commercial zero-emission demonstration and pilot vehicles, as well as to install the supporting infrastructure, this policy recommendation is asking to double the amount of time to liquidate the funds from 2 to 4 years, or a total of 6 years to expend the funds. Yeah, so here's the quiz. Beside the feedback on the policy recommendations themselves, we have some other questions that we thought would be useful while we're putting this together. Based on your experience and perspective, what are the major barriers limiting ZEV uptake in fleets and privately owned? And then what recommendations do you have for improving the pace of the ZEV market overall? And then which are the most important? How would you prioritize all these policy recommendations? And last slide, the next steps. We appreciate any feedback you have as soon as possible, especially by June 15th, so that we can put together a draft report to release later in June. And then we will be doing a presentation at CARB's July board hearing, and we will miss the July 1st deadline to submit the report to the legislature, but we hope to do so in September. Okay, now it's my turn to listen, and if you are asking questions, please identify yourself so that folks, hopefully, that are able to listen in can also hear what's going on. And Marissa has a microphone on that side. And for the folks online, if you could please send your questions to sierrarm@calipa.ca.gov. We will take your questions as they come in. Thank you. Sure. Oops. Somebody's got to have something to say.
Hi, Tim Sessine from Ballard Power Systems. I don't mind starting this off. First of all, many thanks to the Air Resources Board for all the programs that they have in place. We can see that there's a lot of programs underway right now and a lot of moving pieces to keep track of. I think the ARB has done a great job in rapidly propagating zero-emission vehicles out to multiple platforms. The vehicles themselves have benefited from that. What we're seeing on our side, and we're involved particularly in heavy duty in the fuel cell sector, and in buses in particular, the Innovative Clean Transit Rule is now in effect, and there's a lot of planning going on at transit agencies. And there's a lot of concern on the transit side about infrastructure at scale. So now that we have vehicles on the road that have proven themselves to be roadworthy and up to commercial specs, now as we look at fleet adoption, getting the power in, for example, for battery electric buses to charge them sufficiently, and the costs for the utilities and engagement with the utilities has shown to be a pretty high barrier. And I would encourage the Air Resources Board to look at ways of funding implementations at scale to start to expose some of these difficulties of building this kind of infrastructure. Certainly on the hydrogen side, we benefit greatly from larger scale, from aggregation of fuel customers, and as projects get bigger, our costs go down. So the approach for extending the ZEV market from the hydrogen side, I would encourage the ARB to think about regional approaches and also for putting funding into larger scale demonstration projects or larger scale projects through some funding mechanism. The ZAN-ZEV program was an excellent example of scaling up funding opportunities. I would encourage the ARB to look at more opportunities like that. Right now, most of the funding seems to be shifting over towards HVIP and for incentives and getting as many vehicles out on the road in different places as possible. My suggestion would be look at mechanisms for indeed finding ways to scale up fleets. And as I say, expose those issues with infrastructure so that the investments that are being made right now by fleet owners for just a few vehicles can be projected out to when they actually have full fleet adoption. Thank you.
Was my quiz too hard? Is that the problem?
Morning, David Rentschler, Fleet Division with the City of Fairfield. Also Municipal Equipment Maintenance Association Vice Chairman and many other organizations. So we're currently looking at or trying to put in infrastructure for heavy-duty battery electric chargers, running into lots of roadblocks there. Even with consultants that are able to help us manage projects to get the infrastructure in. One of the other things is we were just notified multiple things. One, that some of the new vehicles are going to be coming out with between 800 and 900 volt power systems. Mechanics are used to working on 12 and 24 volt systems. So we've partnered with 14 community colleges, and they're going to see what they can come up with for curriculum, but they don't have any curriculum out there for technicians to learn how to work on this really high voltage applications. So before we start putting these things in, which we're planning on next year, hopefully having up and running equipment, we need people that can repair the chargers or maintain the chargers as well as the vehicles themselves. And then the latest thing with PG&E saying that they will shut down electricity to cities and counties even if inclement weather is not near you. That presents a problem with how are we going to charge this equipment that is needed to keep our cities running when there's no electrical power and the large amounts of electrical power that it will take. And then lastly, the footprint. Our yard, we think, is pretty big. We have a little over 14 acres. We're finding out as we're trying to take the last portion of unused yard and turn it into electric charging station areas, there just isn't enough room. Then if we have to put very large diesel-powered or natural gas-powered generators to provide electricity when the electricity is shut off for up to 48 hours after a natural event or an emergency, we just don't have enough real estate.
Hi, this is Will Barrett with the American Lung Association. Thank you very much for the presentation and the real attention that the agency is giving to zero-emission technologies. We see at the Lung Association the impacts of transportation pollution on public health and local communities throughout the state. And we know that this transition away from combustion technologies to zero-emission technologies is critical to meeting our clean air and climate change and public health goals. So I really do want to say thank you for keeping the focus up and moving all of these different policies forward. I'm not going to prioritize anything in the presentation, but I wanted to just note that we do think that the focus on local government, especially on the outreach and technical assistance to local governments to really help usher a lot of these policies forward is really important, as well as the focus on vehicle miles traveled reduction targets. We know that we can only get so far with the transition to zero emission. We also need the focus on healthy and sustainable communities that give people real alternatives to single occupancy vehicles. So I really do appreciate seeing that in the presentation. The other thing just to note is just the critical importance of making sure that we're making progress on all fronts, on the passenger vehicle side, the medium heavy duty side. And I know that there are many policies under development now to really help move that forward. And we just, again, from a public health perspective, see that as critically important to make sure the entire market across all different vehicle categories moves forward as quickly as possible. The last thing I just had a quick question on was within some of the recommendations, it's clear that there are different triggers that would help them move forward, whether it's legislation or budget actions or other agency actions. Will that kind of thing be specified in the report, like looking at the zero-emission vehicle zones or local government actions? That would specify either voluntary action or state legislation to authorize local governments, that kind of thing. Just a question on how clear or detailed those policy triggers will be in the report. Thank you very much.
Just to answer that quick question, does this mic work? Okay. We will be having some detail. We'll try to be as specific as possible in the recommendations without it becoming super long. So especially for the local governments where they don't have authority, our recommendation will be for the legislature to grant them that authority in terms of whether the local governments do this on their own or require, that is not up to us.
Thank you. I think that'd be helpful to see that, so appreciate it.
Can we just pause for 1 second? We have one question from the webcast email that I will read. How much is CARB staff coordinating with CPUC staff, especially with CPUC's work to develop a transportation electrification framework to guide electricity rates and CPUC investment in transportation electrification for the next 10 years through CPUC rulemaking 18-12-006? And that question is from Peter Okarowski from CEA Consulting. So this is Annalisa from CARB. I'll respond briefly, which is that CARB staff coordinate extensively with CPUC staff on that proceeding and on this effort to develop policy recommendations. We consulted with them multiple times and have numerous other avenues for coordination with them related to transportation electrification as well.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Changus with the Center for Sustainable Energy, and apologize for not having a whole bunch of recommendations for you today, but as we're digesting what was shared, I think we can provide some feedback based on our experience administering the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project and some of the major barriers. The state does have a variety of programs focused on providing support or assistance of some manner to priority populations, low and moderate income customers, as well as disadvantaged communities. But in many instances, the definition of LMI varies from program to program, not just within transportation, but then as we think about SB 350 and barriers more broadly with access to clean energy, that definition is different, and that really impacts the outreach and the education to try and encourage participation and helping folks be aware of what resources are available when there's a great deal of variety in those definitions. So that's something that I don't believe is news to anyone at CARB, and I want to credit the one-stop shop is, I think, a great initiative to try and address some of those concerns, but just wanted to raise that as very much something we've seen as we try and talk to folks, not just about CVRP, but about some of the other programs as well. That continues to become, from an implementation perspective, a challenge. We definitely want to make sure we share some of the feedback too, especially in places like the Valley where there isn't as much access to infrastructure, and when you have folks that aren't single-family homeowners, when they're in multifamily units, the access to charging is also very important. And so as we think about barriers, that's also come up many times from the community, both from community partners who work in those communities and directly from folks that live there. The access to charging infrastructure is something that comes up. So I believe one of the recommendations was kind of consistent funding for a variety of different incentive programs, and I think the infrastructure side is a space that is going to be essential to the vehicle adoption for a lot of folks as well. So, thanks.
Hi there, Alex Loomer with ChargePoint, and we are a charging infrastructure company, so I will take that back with me. I think I just have a couple of quick comments on the incentive programs. I do want to thank staff for all the time you've spent on this, and I look forward to seeing the report. On heavy-duty incentives, really trying to streamline the programs that provide funding for infrastructure, and making sure that agency and fleets are really looking at the grant money as a driving factor, a motivating factor when they're making a decision to purchase an EVs rather than as an afterthought, which we've seen with some of the folks that we've been working with. Looking at medium duty and heavy duty vehicles and buses, while they have Appendix D funding, I think there is a need for more funding to offset operating costs. So software, tools to manage charging time and energy storage. So perhaps there could be funding for a demo project or something along those lines for that sector. And then really trying to support light duty fleet electrification and including infrastructure funding in that effort. And then just touching on the zero emission mile goal, looking at trying to electrify TNCs in that sector. I think depending on the market sector, it's not always best to require that the infrastructure be public. So looking at fleets like Uber and Lyft, sometimes it would be good to have a dedicated infrastructure system for them that wasn't public. So I think CARB'S is in a great position to really help drive this electrification of those sectors through SB 1014 and other mandates that you have. So really trying to electrify the ride share and thinking about the proper incentives and infrastructure for that would be great. And we'd look forward to working with you on that going forward. Thank you.
Hi, Hannah Goldsmith with the California Electric Transportation Coalition, and I'll echo the thanks that you've heard so far in putting this together. I think the initial recommendations that you've put together do touch a lot on the barriers that we see to the market, and so I just wanted to kind of made some notes too to go through. I'd agree that long-term signals, particularly reliable funding, are critical, and would emphasize that funding is our #1 priority, and we think it should be for you too. This is captured in kind of both 1 and 2 of your recommendations, particularly the focus on creative ways to reach cost parity for ZEVs through incentives, but also looking at reducing taxes and fees on ZEVs is great. We support that. Non-monetary incentives are also important, like HOV lane decals. We support holistically looking at ZEV infrastructure barriers and how to scale this up. There's, as we all know, there's a long way to go to reach our state ZEV targets, but there's potentially even farther to go on the infrastructure side in order to make those vehicle targets a reality. And so regarding infrastructure and kind of the local government policies, we've started to see permitting as another huge barrier on the infrastructure side. And so we suggest keeping this issue in mind and advancing kind of next steps to help. I know the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development has been working on this, and there are some, stellar jurisdictions and others that are more challenging. So we've been keeping an eye on that. We'd agree that outreach and education is really important, as well as the workforce development piece in there, and program flexibility as well. It's challenging right now as the Legislature and administration is working with a constrained pot of funds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and I know we'd all like to ensure that that funding can go as far as possible, and we put as few constraints on that funding as possible, but we recognize that that's challenging. So it is nice to see and hear that you're trying to keep everything as simple and straightforward as possible. And we look forward to continuing to work with you on that. And thank you again. I'll end there.
On the line. Hi, Meredith Alexander with CalSTART. So I do want to make a comment that's not directed at these specific questions, which was that I know SB 498 calls specifically for CARB to look at its own programs, but I think as you've already heard from other commenters, it would be a missed opportunity not to look at, especially since you mentioned rates, what progress has been made in the CPUC proceedings and with your sister agency and the Energy Commission around infrastructure, and just to ensure that this is a complete report and not, putting unnecessary blinders on the scope. And then I'll just make a quick comment about the greatest barriers. Obviously, CalSTART has a focus on medium and heavy duty, and many CARB staff are highly aware of the HVIP program. And so, again, we see one of the greatest barriers as being this start and stop funding cycle every year, and the HVIP program having plenty of demand, but then funding, potentially running out in the middle of the year. And what kind of signal is that sending to an industry? I really appreciated the comment about, how many medium and heavy duty ZEVs there are on the road and how it's only 1,000. So this sector is significantly, just behind light duty, and therefore we really need to keep up the pace and be sending the right market signals. Otherwise, that barrier will continue to be as significant as it is now. Thanks.
I just wanted to respond really quickly regarding the other state agency programs. So we're not going to review their programs, but we are going to discuss their programs, if that makes any sense. And so we are going to try to be as inclusive as possible, but we're not going to review other people's programs because that's not our purview. And so when we compare, the statute says compare CARB's programs to those of other jurisdictions, we're going to compare California's programs to those of other jurisdictions.
Thank you, b.Allow, at California Fuel Cell Partnership, and thank you for this. We'll absorb this, review it, and submit something more formally later. But I think it was a very good, comprehensive overview. Really like how you've laid it out and how you're going to approach this. I have 4 or 5 areas of comment. I think the first one, when looking at what are the biggest barriers we see in the hydrogen and fuel cell side, number 1 is awareness. And that's from local jurisdictions, consumers, and even across the agencies. And I'll highlight that for a moment because it is clear we're not hitting our ZEV targets and that we need, and all the analysis within CARB and the other agencies shows we need all the ZEVs to succeed. And yet within there are very different needs between the 2 technologies. So identifying how they're different, where they're different, and making sure the communication across those agencies is there. And that's always one of the more difficult things within a government or a private entity, especially when they're large and multi-jurisdictional this way. Our number 1 challenge really is in the infrastructure. Pretty clearly, I think, known we need more stations and we need more support for those stations. When you look at the ZEV technology, I think we've seen upwards of $1 trillion being committed on one side. We have utilities, Electrify America, and other funds on the battery side focus. Really, it's ARFETP is our lifeline right now. And so finding ways to do this is one of our more important things because we can't plug these cars in at home. These are public infrastructure needs we have. And we've clearly identified, well, let me say that finding that way to incentivize and drive more investment, and it will be policy direction that will help this on the private side. There is a lot of money out there on the private side looking for this. So one of the things we've been working on is a public-private plans that was first to launch the market. We've successfully done that. Last year, we published what the self-sustaining market looks like. What's the end goal? And that was the 2030 vision or revolution we printed. And the idea there is to really outline when this tips into a market where it's not a government subsidy-driven market anymore. It is private investment and goes. And so looking at, I'll say the third area is those government signals. The analysis you've done that really shows, give a lot of credit to CARB staff. I see right over here, they've worked on that self-sustainability. That is critical to us because we're using that as our part of our benchmark on how to succeed. And I think you need that for all technologies when you do investments like this. How do we get government out of this industry or out of this business and get it into an industry-driven perspective? So those predictable policies that you pointed out are really helpful there in light and heavy duty, and we need both. You know, it is clear we need both for our targets to succeed. And I was really excited to see the mention of hydrogen inclusivity in the utility side of this. That's something we've seen a little resistance, maybe it's just not understanding the opportunity where hydrogen can be that coupling device for hydrogen electricity for energy transition. So identifying that and opening that door, I think, will be very effective. The third area is cost. We know we have to drive down costs. That's what that self-sustainability is, to find out where and when we can hit that mark, and really is driven by scale. We can see at scale, we can drive down the cost of the fuel, the vehicles, and the infrastructure, and complete this as a market. And I think that's really it. I'm excited where you're going with this. It's challenging. We'll put some more thought into the comments and provide more there. But really applaud you for all the work you've done and the way you're approaching it from this point forward.
I'm going to pause for a moment here for questions in the room and take a few from the webcast. This next question is from Janelle London from Cultura. She has a few comments with some questions. Number one, awareness of charging infrastructure. For those who don't drive an EV, the perception is that there is no public charging. Would it be possible or advisable to add a bunch of EV charging station highway exit signs to help improve the perception of EV charging availability? Number two, gasoline use tracking or reporting. This seems like the ultimate goal is to reduce gasoline use. Most cities, counties, citizens are not aware of what their gasoline sales are and whether they are going up or down. Would it be possible to publicize, for example, quarterly reports of gasoline sales by city and by county so these jurisdictions could have a target to try to reduce? For individuals, might the state be able to work with, for example, Google to create a gasoline purchase app to encourage reduction in gasoline use? Number three, drivers' education. A great way to educate new drivers about EVs would be to have their first driving experience be in an electric car. Would it be possible to require incentivized drivers' education programs to use EVs for their lessons? Number four, city fleets. Seems like already today, cities should be able to procure only EVs for their public fleets except for certain types of vehicles. Would it be possible to create a model EV first city fleet purchasing ordinance and incentivize cities that adopt it? I think all of those will take some time to respond to, so we will reflect on those and figure out how to integrate the responses into the report. And then we'll take one more question from the webcast now before we go back to the room. This question is from Michael Hartrick from the Auto Alliance. And it's just a question about the timing for desired input and what specific date. And I believe we had June 15th as our requested date on the slide. I'll put that back up again. And please send your comments to Melanie Zauscher, whose email is on the page where these slides are posted.
Bill Boyce with SMUD. Wanted to make a comment that Bill kind of made, and it's really awareness. Kind of one of the 3 pillars that we always consider, but you've got outreach and education kind of identified, but awareness is kind of even at a higher level. And you particularly in the disadvantaged communities and getting awareness built into those, we find is really tough and really important. Kind of like to put in a plug for the Cal ETC Prove It campaign. It's kind of an example of, it's not necessarily a lot of outreach or education, but it is direct awareness into some of those communities to put vehicles in the hands of leaders in those communities. But it's really much more about awareness. I think there's also, studies out there really looking at, the deference of awareness. I know we have in the program, some of the advertising and awareness campaigns from folks like b.Allow's. I will tell you at SMUD, we run full-blown ad campaigns for our free fuel for 2-year programs. It's one of the most successful campaigns we have, period, at the utility. It's not exclusive to electric transportation. So as much of those types of things you can get for general awareness, I think become very valuable in just making people aware. Second comment I'll kind of make, I think we're really about ready to see a lot more emphasis on medium and heavy duty. Having been in the industry a little while, I can tell you kind of the vibe coming from the industry of medium and heavy duty is like where light duty was back in 2010. So on the utility end, we're all starting to gear up really to start supporting construction infrastructure support in that medium and heavy duty. The programs are starting to come in place, and resources are starting to get aligned to support that. So exciting times to see kind of a whole nother suite of vehicles coming. The other part, and I'm very thankful that CARB approaches this way, those markets are totally different than light duty markets. Light duty tends to be homogeneous, whereas each one of the medium and heavy duties kind of has niche markets. There's different needs, different charging infrastructure solutions that kind of fall out. It's good if you all are aware of that because, there's stuff we're finding out like school buses can live with 20 kW charging and not necessarily have to go to like 50 kW DC fast charging and the like, and all that needs to get rolled into some infrastructure planning that I'm sure we'll all get to in the near future. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take a couple more from the webcast. This next one is from Chris King from Siemens. The comment regarding improved policies regarding EV charging infrastructure. One of the challenges with charging infrastructure is that many service providers use proprietary technologies. These technologies reduce access to charging, increase costs, prevent customer switching, and increase the risk of stranded assets. Open standards reduce costs, enhance competition, and increase the availability of products and services. Siemens encourages you to add to your policy recommendations a requirement that any EV charging infrastructure funded with public funds, whether taxpayer or ratepayer, should comply with open technical standards. Okay, so then there's another question from Peter Okorowski from CEA Consulting, asking if we can share thoughts on CARB's potential role in encouraging charging standardization. Can I ask Elise Ketty to provide a very brief update on the ongoing process that is related to this? Hey. That sounds good, thanks.
This is Elise Keddy, Manager of ZEV Implementation in our new Sustainable Transportation to Communities division. And yes, my staff are leading a rulemaking that comment period started earlier this month. The rulemaking is referred to as electric vehicle supply equipment standards, but specifically it is implementing Senate Bill 454, statutes of 2013 regarding accessibility. And that doesn't mean ADA accessibility, that means open access to public charging stations, such that consumers can use stations regardless of membership status in charging networks. It also calls out location information provided to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. We are requiring publicly accessible charging stations to new stations to include credit card readers, meaning EMV chip and near-field communication. And there are also retrofit requirements for existing, again, this applies to stations that require fee for service. Regarding communication standards, we are also requiring that those charging stations install and use open charge point interface, which is a communication protocol that is in use in other parts of the country, and that actually is something that many of the service providers are implementing, but that will help facilitate roaming agreements between pairs of charging networks. But as part of our requirements, we also allow the use of other communication protocols in addition to the OCPI standard. So those are the big pieces. I'll say that, again, we have an open comment period on this, and we will be presenting this to our board at the June board meeting, which is June 27th.
Thank you, Elise. There's another question from the webcast from, I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce your name, Hirag Rabari, Transportation Planning Manager in LA Metro's Countywide Planning and Development Department. We are appreciative of the legislature and CARB's leadership on this issue and agree with the general thrust of the draft recommendations provided. We would strongly recommend, however, as far as allowed by current statute or that could be amended by future legislation, that CARB and the legislature jointly consider program consolidation as a necessary prerequisite for achieving widespread zero-emission vehicle market adoption at scale. CARB currently has 16 different vehicle incentive programs in various stages of development, 12 of which are focused on heavy duty. This limits overall funding availability into smaller programmatic slices with sometimes differing eligibility criteria, application timelines, and implementation requirements. We see this as a major barrier to zero-emission vehicle implementation. It is imperative that there is adequate and accessible funding available to support large, cross-sectoral transportation projects that have a significant nexus with the state's overarching climate, emissions reductions, air quality, mobility, freight and goods movements, and equity goals. We believe the current policy process is an ideal time to consider how best to align existing incentive resources with the need to support large multi-year and multi-generational projects. We would also recommend the consideration of streamlined, consolidated application processes where appropriate with harmonized application schedules. We will be providing a formal letter with more expansive comments and feedback by the June 15th deadline.
Hi, good morning. Ryan Kenny here in the corner from Clean Energy. Hello. Just a quick question. I'm looking at slide 3, which talks about the SB 498 report requirements, and it does mention a cost of benefit analysis, and that the recommendations to the legislature will include how to maximize the effectiveness of the programs. And my company is in the near zero space. We provide renewable natural gas transportation fuel here in California. We do support ZEVs, but we also support a short-term and long-term strategy for both. I was just wondering, in relation to the requirements, how will the LAO report that was issued back in December influence what ARB sends over to the legislature. As many of you know, the report did question the cost effectiveness of the ZEV programs, especially on the light duty side. It did find that the heavy duty space did reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the rest did not. I was just wondering, in relation to slide 3, how will the LAO report influence and be responded to the legislature?
Hi, this is Annalisa. So we'll work to make clear the cost benefit analysis that we have put together in this report and how that relates to the legislative analyst report. And I think we are trying to take a broad view of the benefits in this report, since there are many that are not just emissions reductions, to clarify where the programs can really have an impact.
Thank you.
David Rentschler, City of Fairfield again. So just curiosity in the cost benefit, are you taking into consideration maintenance and not just the cost of actual maintenance, but the cost of training technicians, the cost of trying to hire technicians, mechanics that don't know how to work on this type of equipment, and the cost of training that organizations are going to have to spend if they can find classes to send these mechanics to learn this new technologies and work on the special tooling needed to work on the high voltage, so that the dangers of working on 800 volts doesn't injure mechanics.
This is Annalisa from CARB again. So no, the cost benefit analysis that will be included in this report is focused on CARB's programs, and we do not have, we're focusing on the costs to CARB and the state, and also the benefits that we can either quantify or assess or are related directly to those programs' goals. So we will not actually be accounting for that specific area in this cost benefit analysis, but it's a really good point that that is an area that requires some further exploration. There are no further questions on the webcast, and it seems there are no further questions in the room. Oh.
I'll add one more. Thank you, b.Allow Fuel Cell Partnership. Hearing some of the comments about heavy duty, we're still kind of putting the band together, getting the stakeholders together to really recognize and support the programming you have, because you showed a nice slide of all the things coming. But one thing we've already identified is in this case, it's not integrated like it is on the light duty side. So when we look at the heavy duty market, it's so disparate in pieces and everything. One of the things that's clearly coming out is the state support on building the infrastructure, helping build that out, take some of the pressure off these folks looking at this, being very interested in it, as far as, but not having to do the vehicle and the infrastructure at the same time. So I think that's the baseline there. The other is, as we look at establishing the hydrogen heavy duty infrastructure, that will then tie back to the production needs, because these are such high throughput opportunities. We'll see a lot of, I think, connections, and you had some of this in your slides on how we look systematically at things. But helping establish heavy duty infrastructure in the right places will drive hydrogen production and renewable hydrogen production at that, which will be our focus. So I think it'll be across the supply chain. And there's probably opportunities for light duty. It'll drive the costs down for them as well. It may not be always a co-located type opportunity as much as it will have impacts across all these different pieces. So just something to point out. And thank you again.
All right, well, thank you all very much for your time, and we look forward to hearing more feedback by June 15th. Zero Emission Transportation is the website on CARB that houses sort of where my contact information is if you need to look it up later. So thanks again.